Thank you so much, everyone online, for joining us. If you don't know me, my name is Christian. I am helping to co-convene the seminar series here at POLIS at the Australian National University so we run these seminars every couple of weeks throughout the semester. Notionally, these seminars are about sort of the remit at POLIS, the Centre for Social Research and Policy. We're big on social policy impact and also social research methods. And today we've got a presentation from a number of guest presenters and in-house presenters relating to an area of significant social policy research and research methodologies. Before we get started, as is protocol, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. So here in Canberra, we're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect and acknowledgement to those of you, the elders and traditional owners of the land from which you are joining us today online. I know we've got significant interest in this seminar, and there's lots of people joining us from across the continent today. So today we've got a seminar on Indigenous Standpoint theory, the research practice with, for and by mob. For the purposes of those of you online in the room who aren't familiar with our presenters, here we have Dr. Mark Jones from Doolandua, the Centre for Indigenous Business Leadership at the University of Melbourne. We've got Professor Dennis Foley from Federation University. We've got Dr. Mandy from here at POLIS. And online, we've got Professor Pauline Stanton, who's presenting from Melbourne, from RMIT. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. The presentation is going to go for about an hour. We'll have room for discussion and questions throughout. If you're online, I'll open up the chat shortly, so you're able to put questions and comments in the chat as we go. Towards the end, also, if you want to ask a question in person, you can pop your hand up and I'll be able to unmute you and you'll be able to speak then. If you'd like closed captions online, if you go down towards the bottom, you can click on show closed captions, and you can also show a transcript throughout that. So I think that's all the housekeeping I need to do at this stage, and I might pass it on to Mark to get us going.
Thanks, Christian. And, I'd just probably like to also reiterate acknowledging country, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that to all our guests online and your families. And thank you very much for joining us. I thought to start with, it might be good if you could understand how we're all interconnected. And so to start with, one of our presenters, Associate Professor Charlene Leroy-Dyer at the UQ Business School, is unable to join us today, but I want to acknowledge her contribution and ongoing collegiality, and also congratulate her on the new title, Associate Professor. She's doing some fantastic work up at UQ with her team. So my name's Mark Jones. I'm a Garrajati in Yarraman, so my country's in far north remote Western Australia, Broome. And this is only the second time I'm meeting Dennis, but I did find that email, Dennis, back in 2018 when I first started my PhD. And in your correspondence back here, you mentioned Mark Rose, and Mark Rose is an important person in my PhD candidature. He gave me a lot of cultural competence and advice, and that's a recent portrait of him that looks like there's a fair bit of artistic licensing, given I know him well, but that's how we have Dennis with us. My research also had Lian, Yari for wellbeing, and Nalu, positive emotions for Garrajati, and I came across some fantastic scholarship by Dr. Mandy, and through my candidature, I had the Magnificent Seven PhD supervisors, and through that time, as we know, the changing circumstances in universities. But one person made the distance in terms of the supervision team, and that was Professor Pauline Stanton, who was have received incredibly good advice and mentorship. So I want to thank Pauline as well. I'll pass over to Dennis.
Yeah, thank you. And go to the slides.
You just talk about who you are.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Look, sorry. Kumadabi and Kumadawarangra, Mararon Tianaganiga, Mararon Paelia, and Mararon Guri Pimmel. Also, pay my hearts and spirits to allow us to walk and talk and speak today, and pay my respects to elders past and present in the country. Yeah, my journey in this area is a little bit mixed because I was a critical theorist when I started, and then as my slides will show later on, I won a scholarship to go to Hawaii for 12 months. I'd already written a PhD, so I thought I'd better do something. I started doing some qualitative research over there, and I realised that critical studies wasn't my cup of tea, although it would have got me a PhD easily. And I started looking into this thing called Indigenous Standpoint theory. And a lot of people wrote about it. And I did a literature review, I did a chapter on it. And my supervisors were thousands of miles away. And they came back and told me it was a load of garbage. And I needed a model. What's Indigenous Standpoint theory? No one knows anything about this stuff, and particularly the University of Queensland. So I developed a model, and the rest is history. People have run with it. People have argued against it. I've lost friends over it, academic friends and Aboriginal friends. So it's it's an interesting journey. Here I am today in the twilight of my academic career, and it's been fun. Mandy.
Thank you. So I'm Mandy. I'm based here at POLIS. I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and pay my respects to all Indigenous colleagues here today. I guess from the perspective of my work, I would also like to acknowledge that I have been I've been really, really grateful and honored for many of Mark's family members who have been critical mentors for me as I've been working in Broome and in the Kimberley. And in particular, I'd just like to acknowledge one significant person who's just passed on recently, just last week. It was very, very sad for us all. But I sort of just wanted to make this mention because that person has really been, I think he's been, I think when we think about culture, when we think about country, Leon, and how Indigenous peoples have always lived in that relationality way. And, that person has really been, the one person that I've looked to. So I just wanted to say that.
Pauline.
You're on mute, Alan.
Hello, everyone. I'm coming today from the lands of the Bunurong people in Victoria. I'm actually on the island of Milal. Many of you might know it as Phillip Island, but the Bunurong word for it is Milal. And I'd like to acknowledge the ancestors and past, present, and emerging. I'm incredibly honoured to be part of this panel today. I think it's a real privilege to be involved in research of this kind. I've had quite a long journey now, perhaps over 10 years, and of working with Indigenous scholars. I've been privileged to work with Mark here and also with Mark Rose, who has taught me such a lot. I've had two Indigenous PhD students to completion, one of whom is Mark, and the other one is Aleng To, who is actually an Indigenous person from Vietnam, one member of the Katuk people. And I've currently, Kevin Moore, who's a Gurunji man, is my third PhD student who should be completing shortly. And I just welcome the conversations that we're going to have today and encourage people to ask questions, join in. It's a really, really important webinar today, I reckon. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. And so just before we get started, we're talking essentially from an enterprise perspective and the management disciplines. Look, I think there's this evolving complexity about the use of the word community. So yes, my Yaru Yarra community, so place, but also, often I'll talk from, the First Peoples enterprise ecosystem perspective, which is a different kind of community. And one of the key points that I'll probably make, just, I would suggest, I'm accepted to say within the Yaru community, and as is Mandy, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're accepted by all communities. So I think when you do First Peoples research, specificities is really critical. And of course, we don't speak for all First Peoples. I mean, a homogenous mob, we are not. I think one of the real challenges that I experience is that we've all been put into this one grouping, and there's incredible diversity amongst First Peoples. And of course, what we say can be contested. I preference the use of First Peoples, but at times we need to be flexible given the complexity of our research. And business has a duplicity of meaning. It can be sorry business and a range of other customary practices. So I preference the word enterprise. And so today, we're really keen to get through the slides and have a discussion. We've got about 100 people online, and we really want to elevate the understanding of for, with and by, as opposed to on and about. And so through our presentation, we're going to talk about supervisory practice, research, publications. We're looking, to support non-Indigenous scholars' practice. Okay, so both Indigenising and decolonising the research practice. Both Dennis and I we utilise Indigenous Standpoint theory in our practice, but it's also important to recognise that non-Indigenous scholars also have a standpoint, and they can use that as well. And we've already started to sort of surface the importance of relationality and accountability, which I'll go into in the forthcoming slide. But I really want to sort of take away any sort of theoretical sort of approach and give you practical examples of what I mean. And throughout our presentation, I think you'll see this, the presence of a First Peoples worldview. We're talking about the enterprise ecosystem in most of our examples. We'll talk about Lian First Peoples concept, or a Yaru concept of well-being, and then the aspiration of such as Mabu Lian, good well-being. And there's a multiplier effect within First Peoples scholarship, and we'll get to that as well. Okay, so accountability, I just thought rather than talk theory, I just give some examples of my own accountability linked to the Yaru community. So I had a cultural reference group. So specificities are really critical. I sit on a couple of human research ethics committees, and I see the growing sophistication, in particular of non-Indigenous scholars wanting to do First Peoples research, and the support, or they'll go and get support from somebody who is First Peoples, or they'll go to a community organisation, but it lacks specificity. So I would encourage you to be very specific with who you're getting that support, that consultation, that community endorsement. In my research, where possible, I use Yaru language. It's something that I was gifted, and I am really fortunate to be able to use that. For me, accountability. So in referencing Rowe, when we can all do Rowe 2010, or Rowe and Casey, is the other author of Nalu. But my cultural reference group said, no, we want you to actually speak with Uncle Joe's son and get permission. And so Brendan, who's on the far right there, it took me 3 months to finally get him on the phone. Okay, so this is this piece about time. Okay, so time for First Peoples is non-linear. Okay, and I think you really need to understand that, because if you try and progress things in a manner that's transactional, your research outcomes will be far less than what they could be. But 3 months it took me to get Brendan, because he's a fly-in, fly-out worker. I got him on the phone and he said, yes, you have my permission, and the key thing that I would like you to do is come and have a cuppa and lunch with me next time you're in town. So, as we all know, we had a nasty virus. So that took until September 2023. So it took me 4 years to finally meet Brendan, and you know, it was a real honour. So that's a different way of being accountable to community. You know, I look to elevate founders' voices. So ownership, again, problematic. So the language that the people that I spoke with, they used founders. So I utilised that from an Indigenous standpoint theory perspective. I elevated them as experts, as authors of their own narrative. You know, and I reported back to my cultural reference group as well. That went pretty well, and you can probably see in the image in the bottom right corner, it's it's quite a family affair, and the one where I'm looking at like I'm King Henry VIII. I put that up because I thought it was a good example, because that's probably when I was reporting back, there were a few frowns, and I didn't understand why. And that's a beautiful gift from one of my supervisors, Dr. Al Fricker, and it's a possum skin, and it's got the story of my PhD on the underside burnt in. And however, as I was very, very quickly told, when I said, "What's is there a problem?" and they said, "What are you wearing?" and I replied, "Oh, possum skin." I got that. I can see that, and so we don't wear possum skin. So in future, I need to wait to be gifted a kangaroo skin. Is what I'm meant to wear as a garage man. So we're learning all the time, and hopefully, today when we get to the discussion, we can exchange questions and learn together. And just even something as simple as this authorship piece, I just thought I'd put that down. These are the differences in First Peoples research. So in this acknowledgement for a forthcoming paper, I mean, I'm the first author, but in terms of cultural protocols, and Mark Rose, my Gunja Jamara colleague, he goes first. So there's a little bit of difference, and cultural protocols continue to influence our practice. Okay. What is relationality in the ecosystem? Well, I mean, it's wildcat. He says it's yet to really coalesce and its discernible approaches. So it's, for me, it's a real practice. We've got multiple overlaying relationships, whether they be the humans, the spirit world, the natural worlds, and I know Dennis is going to come to that, so I won't go into too much more detail. In the enterprise space, I can assure you that the enterprise ecosystem, which goes all over this continent, it is still influenced by cultural protocols and practice. But we need to understand that this ecosystem, it doesn't exist purely on country. So there are a number of the founders are working off country, both economic opportunity and the history of colonisation is nature, two major influences as to why. And our objective, both the founders but also Dennis and myself as First People academics, we're looking for communality, for the benefit of the many. That's one of the key things that we're trying to achieve. And this concept of relationality, it takes time, but it's fundamental for the foundation of high quality research that is for, with, and by mob. Now, I thought I'd just share with you some unrelational practices. I was going to ask Dennis to do a slide on this as well, but I recognise that it's people's actions like Dennis and those First People academics that have gone before me, that have allowed me to actually be in this thing called the academy. And, I just want to get the point that this is not an easy place for First People. And these are recent examples. I'm a relatively freshly minted PhD, despite my grey beard and age. And I mean, these are the types of things that were said to me or I experienced there. In particular, I just highlight that the confirmation of candidature, because that was about Indigenous Standpoint theory, and the panel member, he wanted to know, how am I going to modify my writing style to make it more palatable for non-Indigenous readers? And we're not writing, that's not our purpose. So that was a really enlightening moment. So for me, I've had some pretty harsh things I think said to me at conferences. I think you probably, as a general rule of thumb, First People often coming to do a PhD, they're often older, but I'd hate to think that a younger person might be exposed to those types of comments. And even within the university system, I had academics coming to me and asking me to go on various grants, which I was absolutely ill-equipped to do, and I didn't proceed. And I got really good advice from my supervision team for things to consider. And so that's where Mark Rose talks about hegemonic drift and the seduction of the academy, and I'm as equally potentially influenced by such as well. And in terms of research, I mean, there is still a volume of research that comes out that is the antithesis for with and by mob, and I've de-identified that paper, but I mean that's 2023, and that's by a non-Indigenous, non-First Peoples academic talking about us, and certainly there are a group of us that found that paper incredibly disappointing, and collectively as scholars we should all accept and expect a lot more than what that paper offered. And it's these minor things, such as tensions. We need to publish in journals, that help our careers. I get that, but particularly with special issues, what we're identifying is we're questioning perhaps the special issue editor's capacity and skills to do Indigenous special issues. And what we'd like to see is perhaps more of an invitation for us to be part of that process. And when we write papers, we need to position ourselves so we know who we're talking to, who we're talking from, these connections. That's what we're looking for when we identify ourselves. And minor things, again, a lowercase I, as Dennis has said previously, we're real people, and I reject journals saying that they can't do a capital I, they can't do a capital P for First Peoples, because I've done it and they will do that. So that's my standpoint. We promote relational citations where we utilise First Peoples scholars, but a lot of the discipline we're writing in, often where the first time First Peoples has written on this topic, so it's not easy. So we do use Western scholars, and we've all had those harsh critiques, I'm sure, from journals and stuff, and right now, Charlene, myself, and Diane, we're going through a process, and we're trying to create a really relational practice with a range of scholars for a special issue that we're doing. So we're trying to do it a bit different. Now pass it over to Dennis, who's going to talk all about Indigenous Standpoint theory.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mark. My aim is just to give you my push on, the light that's hitting First Nations voice and spirit, history of my research thinking, the model and trends since 2004, current research, looking at 2 unpublished theses from 2023, and that I had the pleasure of marking, and the future of Indigenous Standpoint from my position. In the late 90s, we saw a small group of people, Indigenous people, including myself, begin to explore a new concept within academia. Yet it was still really an old way, and it was First Peoples knowledge systems. We were trying to bring that in. And at the time, I had the pleasure of working with Michael Williams and John Budby. And John Budby was the key to my thinking at the time. And Michael was good, but Michael was sort of in a different sphere, but still he kept me on the straight and narrow. And Indigenous, and probably while I talk about that, there was a non-Indigenous academic, a archaeologist, I can't think of his name, it'll come to me, at UQ, who was absolutely brilliant because he kept saying, no, think about this, think about that. And yeah, he broadened my horizon instead of just going down the path of white academia. So Indigenous Standpoint approach to knowledge was bold for its time in the 90s. A lot of people wrote about it, but no one put it in a model, as I said before. And there was a resurgence or renaissance in Indigenous scholarship that happened at the time, mainly in sociology, in nursing and education, and the argument of colonial concepts within feminist standpoint, most of it in America and New Zealand, and sister girl from Stradbroke Island. Aileen Moore Robertson was probably one of our first speakers at the time from a feminist standpoint. Critical theory emerged, and we also relied heavily on African American scholarship. Inside or outside of theory was the main thing there. But over the last 30 years, there's been increased numbers of academic qualified Indigenous scholars within the colonial education university system, and I stress it is still a colonial education system. And we've seen major developments with First Nations scholarship in Canada, America. The First Nations University in Regina is a classic, whereas there's been resurgence in some other parts of Canada on the East Coast. America in certain areas, the Pacific, Aotearoa, of course, and I basically revisit my old paper in 2000 and, I revisited 2023. As I mentioned before, it all happened here in Hawaii. When you're in Hawaii, the exotic nature of the place, and I got involved with the Hawaiian Kanaka community, and it was these three ladies, my frijon, my realisation that everything I'd learned in academia was a load of colonial garbage. Dr. Menelaya Maya, Meliana Maya, and Maili Maya, three sisters, and they were instrumental in telling me or flushing my brain in some ways. I'd already written my PhD. I was in Hawaii for 12 months on a Fulbright, and this was just a total a reborn academic thinking. I changed my methodological approach from critical theory and started to use Indigenous Standpoint theory. And like I said, a lot of people wrote about it, but there was no model, there was no steps. You just didn't know how to do it. So I was exposed to native Hawaiian philosophy, this Hawaiian onto epistemology, very similar to Kapapa Māori, which I learned later on in my postdoctoral studies in New Zealand, in Aotearoa. Previously, during my masters, I toyed with the concept of Indigenous Standpoint theory. However, the lack of Indigenous supervision and guidance ensured that I was unable to pursue my interest. It is so hard to do Indigenous qualitative study unless you have an Indigenous supervisor. There are great non-Indigenous people out there, but I found it impossible, both at Griffith and UQ and all the other universities I tried to enrol at. In fact, I tried to enrol at every university on the Eastern Seaboard. None would accept me, and I had to take University of Queensland to court through the union when they finally accepted me as a PhD student. Well, think about it. Based on the University of Hawaii, I was introduced to native Hawaiian philosophy, Kanaka Māori methodology, which linked the land, the earth, and the sky, maintaining the metaphorical link to water, land, rocks, trees, mountains, and the heavens. Now, what is so interesting about this for me, these are the things that my uncles and my grandmother talked about, but colonisation through the 50s and the 60s had drummed that out of us. So whilst my elders talked about it in the 50s and the 60s, I didn't really understand it. And our education system just completely destroys it in your mind. Here, I was able to relearn it. So that's me. It's not me, but it's the image of me tearing up a thesis that I've already written. It would have passed. I know it would have passed. And so this voice and spirit was just, it was like a consuming bushfire. The empowerment from the Hawaiian colleagues in the community. And I went out and gave talks in community colleges and like what we call a Tate College. And sometimes it was standing room only. And it was just incredible, this feedback I got from people who weren't academics, who told me I was on the right track. And from, this little fellow from, Queensland, who's sort of an ex-banker, this was just all new and it was just so powerful. Because all of a sudden I felt as though all my elders were with me. And that was the great thing. So there was a new approach in perspectives, language and design, and also using your language and understanding your language, which is really hard for those who have been broken from our basis. So critical theory had shortcomings. I questioned traditional Western approaches to research methodology. In fact, I really questioned it and think it was all wrong. And there needs to be an Indigenous research methodology. Now, I was 7,565 kilometres away from my supervisors. Unlike the caged bird in a research centre, I was free to understand new concepts, approaches, and to basically throw my heart and my soul into new things. And I came crashing down after the first draft literature review on Indigenous Standpoint theory, because coming from a rigid sandstone institution, a school of graduate management demanded a model. I had to have a model. So I thought, well, what's this model? I went back out to the Hawaiian community, and so we started to develop. And they said, no, don't use our stuff, use your stuff. So I did a model, so that basically so the white folk could understand it. And I'm sorry if that sounds crass, but I had to do that because I had to get my non-Indigenous supervisors and the school manager to understand what I was talking about. Just before I went to Hawaii, I met this fellow. He was a life changer as well, Lester Irabana Rigby. And like Lester, I knew Errol West well. John Budby became, as you mentioned before, about his supervisor. Now, John didn't have a PhD, but John became the best PhD unofficial supervisor I ever had. I knew Colin Burke well, and Colin Burke was a great sounding board. He didn't necessarily believe in what I was doing, but still he was sounding, same as Eve Faisal. Only Eve, she didn't believe in what I was doing, but she was still a great sounding board. And there were many others who freely gave their time and advice. And that's what an Indigenous scholar needs. He needs those Indigenous contacts. That networking theory needs to really kick in and work. However, one of the main values that I learned in this process is reciprocation, which is an old value that goes way back prehistory. And reciprocation, so you've got to make sure you give back to these people that give their time to you. And you do that in different ways. Sometimes it's with their students. Indigenous scholars need Indigenous role models and advisors and supervisors. I can't stress that enough. I don't say any negative against my non-Indigenous supervisors, but man, life would have been great with an Indigenous supervisor. Now, I went back and the Maya sisters put me back into my own spiritual philosophy. And our whole concept of existence is around the physical world, the human world, and the sacred world. So I thought this is the free atoms that are spinning around that control who I am and the existence of our people, the Gomarical people of the Sydney Basin and the Darug and all the other people. We all have the same thing. Physical world is the land, food, culture, spirit, Indigenous identity. And that identity is a key part about Indigenous Standpoint as you develop as an academic. It also encapsulates the land, the sky, and the living organisms, which fits in with the both Māori and also the Hawaiian concepts. Human world, which is people, family, rules of behaviour, ceremonies, and capacity to change, which is one thing people don't often give us credit for, but we do change. The sacred world is not really about the metaphysical, as many would believe. It is spiritual, but it's about the physical well-being of all creatures. And no doubt I met several Aboriginal academics who were Buddhists, and they gave me a wonderful insight into this as well, and I've since followed Buddhism as well. The retention and reinforcement of oral history was key, the care of country laws and maintenance. This is the sacred world. Now, when you add native Hawaiian epistemological approaches adopted by Dr. Benelani Meyer in her publications in 1998 and 2001, the interpretation of Indigenous epistemology, you have an environmental imagery which includes stone, water and forest, because the metaphors of those things actually apply to the physical world, the human world, the sacred world. So Hawaiian epistemology is based on the significance of ocean, land, stone, water, wind, forest, and lastly, sky. which is all about, the Polynesian existence. So I just found that so many similarities. Now, when I added Lester Irvine Rigny's model, I got structure. So I saw resistance as the emancipative imperative. The political integrity was in the Indigenous research, and the privileging Indigenous voices was also in the Indigenous research, which meant I had to go back. The side effect was you go back and you look at Indigenous research rather than Western, may I say, research that, particularly anthropological and sociological, which had really hidden the true meanings of what we were saying. Rigny qualifies his views by acknowledging there's no cultural homogeneity amongst us, just as we've said before. And we have the potential in many instances to be more aware and respectful of each other's cultural traditions, which included the non-Indigenous cultural traditions of the University of Queensland's Graduate School of Management, which I found was walking in two worlds. But above all, you're accountable not only to your academic institutions, and this is where it's different from a non-Indigenous student. We are also accountable to the Indigenous communities, the individual people, and their epistemological standpoints and the cultural appropriateness. So, and I'll give an example of this. I've often talked about and researched Gunda Chamara, and one day I had the joy of going out to the Gunda Chamara people in Lake Conda, and it was in a board meeting and all the elders were there, and they said, "Oh, you're the bloke from the University of Queensland, and now you're down in Melbourne. You've been talking about us for years, haven't you?" And I said, "Yeah." They said, "It's going to cost you." And I went, "Oh no," because I hadn't done the cultural thing of getting prior approval before I talked about them in lectures. Because about the eel farming, I just find it so exciting. Anyway, they said, "Yeah, it's going to cost you." And I said, "Oh no, what's going to cost? Free computers." So that was the cost. So they put it into a Western, Western value, and my crime was paid for by free computers. When I delivered the free computers, they said, "Where's the printer?" Yeah, and so it was just, but it was the way. This is that concept of reciprocation, that old value that you've got. Unless you're watching yourself all the time, you do lose those values. Now, the late Errol West, his Jampanaka paradigm formed a structure where his ontology of the cultural, the spiritual, the secular, the intellectual, the political, the practical, and the personal, and the public dimensions gave you steps you could just go through. And what's interesting, when I've had a non-Indigenous student that's used IST, they've actually followed that same system very closely with Indigenous supervision, and they've been able to apply it, but apply it from a non-Indigenous position, recognising the Indigenous standpoint, because they're doing research on Indigenous people. So the Warlpiri elder paradigm gave us the structure for the middle. So put it all together. Oh, sorry, the result was the DVC research in 2005 gave me the accommodation for outstanding research. Not bad for a bloke who had to push his way through. And I submitted a thesis without a supervisor. Both my supervisors left 6 months before I submitted. So I actually submitted a thesis without supervision, the final paper, and I still won the DVC's award. So that was the big cherry on the cake, and the thing that kept me going. So whacking them all together, I got the physical world, the sacred world, and the human world with Lester Irvine Rigny's resistance, political integrity, and Indigenous voice. There's the interacting models. The non-Indigenous people can understand that, the examiners. The Jampanaka paradigm, the 8 subsets are in the middle. So you've got a structured set of things to follow through. And then you've got the Hawaiian concepts of the metaphorical aspects of Indigenous belief, Indigenous epistemological, and this metaphor of the sky. The sky is much more than just blue things and never, never. It's also the heavens. It's where in our beliefs, the ancestors go. So it has all that in there. And my dream was this could be applied to other people, to other Indigenous scholars. It wasn't meant, and this was just phase one of many phases. I wanted more people to debate it and develop it, and Mark's about the only one that really took it on. So what next? I spent the next 20 years getting fat and lazy because I was really keen to get people to follow it and go through. And I just laid back thinking someone would do. Now, the late Dean Jarrett, a wonderful scholar, he was in Sydney and passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. he took it up and he ran with it, and he was fantastic. But I think I created a groundswell, particularly in Aotearoa. Now, the developments, we saw Chai and Woodlock, and I'll go through these very quickly. They don't really, it's just something to know. But Chai and Woodlock, they integrated IST to provide outcomes for Indigenous learners and their communities, which was great. It's in education. Martin responded to the obligations to country and community. Karen Martin from Stradbroke Island, and I think her approach was groundbreaking at the time. Another wonderful person I've had the joy to work with, Blanche and Wilson, reviewed the notion of Indigenous epistemologies and the way of knowing, and they applied it to their communities, and they provided a practical common framework to underpin their research methodologies. So they used it to underpin their research methodologies. That was, for me, groundbreaking. Adriel argues in a paper aimed at non-Indigenous scholars about the sovereignty of IST, and he suggests that non-Indigenous people who dominate the fields of citizenship, shared responsibility, name, title, reconciliation, etc., also embrace IST, which sadly is lost in things like self-management, multiculturalism, native title, and reconciliation. Anyway, I won't worry too much about it. But Aileen Morton Robson, 2013, she wrote extensively emphasising Indigenous women's standpoint. Now, Indigenous standpoint theory in my development came from feminist standpoint. I looked at bell hooks and I looked at wonderful scholars like that. So when Aileen came along with her PhD in the early 2000s, talking up to white women, she put it into a publication. It fell into place, everything that I'd been learning. So Aileen and I had great long talks about that, because I wanted to make sure that my interpretation of IST came from a feminist standpoint in the right way. Because she took feminist standpoint, a black feminist standpoint, because there's many feminist standpoints. But I followed the bell hooks one, and then I went into insider-outsider theory from the African-American approach. And then, because Native America hadn't done it at that stage, and then it followed on and developed. Now, Kaya, I can never pronounce Kaya, thesis formed the concept of storytelling, and they used speculative fiction to challenge colonial stereotypes. This was a whole new way of writing a thesis. It was actually around a fictional work and using colonial stereotypes to imagine Indigenous futures. I found that really challenging to read, and I found it fantastic that there was that application of IST in a total different form to anything that I'd thought of, because I've come up through a business school, where it's pretty rigid, and here's something that's really out there. Now, Yunka Porter and Schulingsworth, if you don't read Yunka Porter's work, where have you been the last 10 years? They looked at IST as either disengaging or looking at the shallow and tokenistic ways that IST have been used by scholars, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I have done a few papers where I talk about the free curses, the ham, lettuce and cheese, academics. They talk about Nakata, Aileen Morton Robertson, the lady from New Zealand, Linda Bird, Smith, Linda Twiney Smith, and a few others. And they'll choose about 3 of them, bang, and they'll put them in the literature review. Yeah, it looks great, they get a tick, but they don't discuss it. There is no grounding in what they're talking about. And that's what Yunka Porter and Schulingsworth were talking about. They outline a need for self-reflective work by those scholars prior to and during their research process. I have failed several PhD papers because the literature review, the research and the outcomes are 3 different things that aren't joined together. Because they skillfully go through, they discuss IST, they discuss all the Indigenous scholars, but they don't do anything. Then came along 2021, this is when Santa Claus came to me, Cox and others, it's a big long list of people. They used Indigenous standpoint theory as I thought about it in a Native American concept, and they really looked at a structure there, and they did pre-work. I'll just go for pick out the first thing. Indigenous standpoint aids in interpreting how the intersections are unique to Indigenous Indians. And I'm sorry if I'm using words there, but this is their language, including the effects of colonisation, tribal and other identities in a cultural context and structural inequalities for their communities. It integrates Indigenous ways of knowing with Western research orientations and methodologies in a collaborative process that works to decolonise the social science research. And IST promotes direct application of benefits to African American communities. exactly as it was intended in my thesis. I thought it was wonderful. I was on heaven. And then I marked 2 theses in 2023. Wolfgram, which is Marty, and I'll talk about hers a little bit more, and then Mark Jones, and the third wave, brilliant paper. And as is Wolfgram's, her creating a Māori Indigenous model of evaluation. Now, Mark's, and he'll probably talk about his own, will you, I think? I don't need to go, oh, okay. The thing that grabbed me about this is, you know, he's looked at all of the main authors, his literature review is good, but the key things, he recognises the lived experience of Indigenous people. He resonates the emancipatory underpinning of self-determination, just as Rigby did, economically and epistemologically, academically, and reverberated the echo of the Indigenous voice. And he retained the knowledge for co-researchers and community for the benefits of the many. Brilliant. I hadn't missed out on the benefit of the many. I don't think I pushed that enough. IST is liberating for First People scholars in its ability to solidify their academic invisibility and collectivism and the approach to the other as it embraced by the world's Indigenous intelligentsia. Having said that, try and get a paper published in an A-grade journal using IST. Impossible. Now, Tanya, her work, brilliant, but Māori are different to us. Māori have kapapā Māori, and Māori have their own approach, which is very similar to IST. Even though they quote IST, it's founded on cultural concepts of knowledge, knowing physical origins, cultural understandings. They already have it built into their ontology. So they don't really need the IST that I'm promoting and Mark's since developed further. What Māori do is take kapapā Māori to a higher level. And they're so fortunate, the good scholars over there. You know, the holistic, balancing, spiritual, psychological, biological, social, political, and other cultural elements of forms of life. This thesis is one of many that I've marked that is brilliant. They have a skill with their knowledge systems, but when you've got all your supervisors are Māori and you've got a depth of knowledge and a depth of literature that goes back over 100 years, you know, the Matatanga, the elder knowledge, you know, their whānau, their families, you know, God, our families were split up and torn apart, you know, so were theirs, but they're able to manage, and that's their strong ontology. So their understanding of IST is different to ours, and I would never rubbish Māori research by not adopting ours, because I think theirs is just as strong, if not stronger. The future. We walk in 2 worlds. We really do. The 2 cultural clashes. Indigenous people within academia. It's a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. The low employment levels we have, the low levels of academic professors. I think the creation of academic PVCs, average Indigenous PVCs, has been a positive step, but we still walk in 2 worlds. So research-wise, it is still difficult. It is still difficult to get an ARC. It's still difficult to get other awards, particularly if you're relying on IST. Some of the comments that we have from the Academy through the ARC are literally deplorable. And some of these people should hang their heads in shame. I question why they're there. Something similar to the comments that Mark mentioned earlier on. I've had some shockers, you know, so you've got to walk in 2 worlds. You've got to use a standard Western methodology if you're going to use IST in an ARC application, if you want to win it. Now, this is the overlapping protocols. Now, Mark talks about ethics, reflexibility, resourcing and research, refinement and alignment in this Indigenous process model. This I see as the development of my model into a wonderful, more structured model that is easier to understand. Mine was more imagery and more about the psychological aspects of the research. This, I think, is far more practical. And so if we just went through ethics, reflexibility, resourcing and research, refine and align, very early in my work in Hawaii, before, wrap it up, no worries, the 4 things I was told was humble, humility, reciprocation, and your ethical approach. So this was key. So this comes into Mark's, if you haven't read it, this is his 3rd wave, brilliant. And thank you. I've gone over.
That's all right. So I guess the previous slide was, my very Western analytical framework, but across the research journey, I've got a little bit more confidence, and in my final chapter, that's my analytical framework. It's informed by my Yaru identity. Of course, there's a range of accompanying words to it, but I think Dennis has made the point. You've got to have both, particularly in these schools of business, or colleges of business where we sit. But I was really proud of that. One of my founders produced that, and I'm pretty excited that we'll bring that in together as a co-author in a book chapter next year. I guess one of the questions that I often get asked is, can non-Indigenous scholars engage with Indigenous standpoint theory? Can they use or learn to do yarning? Can First Peoples scholars use a Plains Cree methodology? And that's being presented at a conference in Wellington next year by Rob Wilson. Just if anyone's thinking it's Sean Wilson, it's not. And then another candidate, Kevin Moore, doing some really enlightening work around two-eyed seeing and Indigenous lens as it applies to the Victorian treaty. And can non-Indigenous scholars use First People concepts like Lian, which I'll hand over to Mandy.
Thanks. I guess I just wanted to briefly share work that sort of stemmed from my PhD research, and in terms of how I responded to the concerns and calls by Indigenous scholars and communities around research and how we can work together to co-produce knowledge. And I just wanted to highlight two opportunities that presented itself that allowed me to engage or respond in a manner that I did with Yaru. Firstly, it was Peter Yu at that time, who was the CEO of MBY, addressing an ABS conference, and he was questioning the utility of the Closing the Gap strategy, and about how, with Yaru's own approach to evidence-based, they would construct a Yaru Wellbeing Index. And for me at that time, as someone employed at CAPA, who worked a lot with census and ABS surveys to create composite indices of well-being. And I was really trying to see, as an economist trained in quantitative methods, trying to sort of say, is there a way that I can think and embed and elevate Indigenous voices and their ways of thinking without just using census data? And so that would then lead me onto a journey which was many years long and required several iterations of the way I worked, but it's been really, really transformative. I just really wanted to briefly stop here because as Dennis and Mark have said, standpoint is a really critical element. But as I was working through my PhD, looking at the various literature on standpoint, none of it really spoke to me, because on the one hand, it came from an Indigenous standpoint, but there was also a large body of literature which talked about non-Indigenous standpoint, but from a Western lens. And so, me as a migrant to Australia, I was really trying to think, well, that didn't really speak to me as a non-Indigenous standpoint. So I was also quite aware that my shared Asian ancestry with many Yaru community members meant that they were more open to talking with me and connecting with me. But then that did not extend to a shared historical experience. So how did I then, try and work respectfully with them through the methodology that I had been accustomed with, but I'm really trying to extend that through a mixed methods approach. And so I really, I guess one of the pieces of work that I really responded to was one who was also one of my panel members, Tahu Kukutai, but a piece that she had written with Maggie Walter around the recognition principles. So this was at a time when the Indigenous data sovereignty movement was really growing or just beginning. And they were sort of saying that for data to be functional for Aboriginal communities, it had to meet 5 recognition principles. It had to recognize geographical and cultural diversity. It had to recognize different ways of knowing. It had to have mutual capacity building, incorporate Indigenous decision-making throughout the entire process. And so I tried to, I guess, reflect that or embed that as best I can in the way that I work. So when I first started, when I first went to Broome, I thought, because I was working with like census data, that I would try and capture like all of Broome. But in my first meeting with Yawuru, I very quickly realized that I had to work with Yawuru as a distinct group and peoples because their experience was very different, and they were also native title holders at that time in Broome. As Mark said, the late Uncle Niparo had talked about Nalu, but because he was also a Yawuru man, he talked about Lian. And so we started with this concept of Lian rather than well-being, of understanding how we might think about alternative ways of looking at well-being. It also involved working very closely with Eunice, who I've been working with now since 2013, forming that Yawuru Reference Guidance Committee that's made up of the individuals down there, but also a person that recently passed, as I mentioned, and I have excluded his picture from there. But the mutual capacity building has really been something that wasn't really there at the beginning of my research. When I first approached Yawuru, the first question they asked me was, how would this benefit us? How would our community, what would they get out of it? And at that time, all I could say in my email, as we were reflecting back with Eunice at the end of the PhD, I said, I only have $7,000. This is all I can do, and this is all I can give back. But we said we would just revisit, in a year's time when this work had to see where we would be at. And so I won't sort of spend too much time because I know we are running out of time, but this essentially was some of the stories that were shared. So we started with stories from Yawuru women and men about what Lian meant to them. But importantly, it's been the process of generating indicators around well-being that you can really see Yawuru voices throughout the entire process. So where the stories were given to me around Mabu Lian, that became the source of an indicator. So every indicator, so there were about 103 of them, can be traced back to something that a Yawuru person had said. That was then workshop in focus groups with Yawuru women and men. So we have a women's framework, but we also have a men's framework. And where there were commonalities that became part of the Yawuru well-being framework. And from there, we then created the survey question. So sharing fish, for example, was a critical part. So whether someone had shared it and whether they had also received it because of that reciprocity element that was really highlighted in the stories. And this approach, Eunice and I found really centered oral history as a way of producing knowledge and transmitting knowledge. So every story, every question can be traced back to a community member. And when we were about to think about doing a survey, Eunice and I had a chat then and said, well, if me and her both went out to do the data collection, only the two of us will benefit from this. And because, as I mentioned, the data sovereignty movement was growing, we then approached Bankwest to see if they might fund 10 community researchers to collect the data with us. So we managed to get $50,000 from Bankwest so that we could train the women there around survey designs, data collection, which we then went out to community and collected the data. 156 Yawuru women and men shared their stories with us. And so 800 dumplings and 20 pots of curries and rice later, we were able to produce this report, which was launched in Broome, and Bankwest kindly brought all their stakeholders to Broome because it had to be done on country to launch the report. And I know Dennis and Mark both talked about that element of reciprocity. I guess what's been really critical here is that Yawuru then has a baseline to work out what was important for them and how the PBC would work to maintain and enhance well-being for Yawuru. But importantly, the information that we collected in the report became evidence for them to then source funding to build the Yawuru Cultural Wellbeing Center. And so this was a way of giving back apart from having the thesis. So I think I might stop there, but I guess just a very quick point. I think this has been completely, I've really had to think about how to do research differently, how to work differently. And Eunice and I often spend a lot of time, apart from co-authoring papers, but thinking about how we can highlight the role of a community researcher, researcher, what skills they bring. And sometimes it's not about writing, which is the key element that academics might be thinking about, but it's the authority and the expertise that come in other forms that are equally, if not more important than the writing itself.
Really, that's just a summary of my thoughts and about Mandy's research, because she's very much a love part of our Yaru community, and I think it's a really good exemplar. So, and I want to thank you. We're going to pass it over now to Pauline, if you're still with us online, Pauline.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Mandy. You just said something about learning to do things differently, learning to do research differently. So I'm just going to talk about my experience, first of all, as a non-Indigenous supervisor of Indigenous students, PhD students. And Mark reminded me this slide is taken from a seminar that we did together about 2 years ago now at RMIT. And we were talking to a group of the current Indigenous, non-Indigenous supervisors who were supervising Indigenous students, and supervisors, academics who wanted to become supervisors of non-Indigenous students. So it was we were doing this presentation, and these were two comments that came up about Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous standpoint theory. So one non-Indigenous supervisor said, well, I don't see it as my role to learn Indigenous methodologies. And another non-Indigenous academic who was hoping to become a supervisor said, oh, the Indigenous standpoint theory reading, oh, they're so hard, they're so complex to read. Now, those were things that I didn't actually agree with, but I did understand the concern of a non-Indigenous person, researcher, really kind of using or getting involved with Indigenous standpoint theory, and I was a little bit worried about doing the wrong thing. We've stolen so much. Is this another cultural appropriation? And I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with Professor Aileen Morton Robinson, who Dennis has mentioned, who was a distinguished professor at the time at RMIT. And I said to her, oh, I'm just a bit uncomfortable about this. And she looked at me and she said, what? She said, you think you can supervise Indigenous students and you've never read any Indigenous standpoint theory? Of course you've got to read it. Of course you've got to engage with it. And it was almost like she gave me permission to do that. And that's been a really important part of my learning journey. So moving along to the next slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So Dennis has talked about the importance of having Indigenous supervisors, and I absolutely agree with that. So my first Indigenous student was actually Elang To, who was actually from Vietnam. Now in Vietnam, they don't use the word Indigenous to talk about ethnic minorities. And in Vietnam, there's quite a history of controversy and tension in relation to the ethnic minorities. And that's because in the past, some of those groups and tribes have actually identified with the wrong side, so they took the side of the Americans in the American War, they took the side of the French in the French War. So there's an uneasiness often. Now, when Alan first came to join us at RMIT, he wanted to learn all about HRM in Vietnam. That was what his thesis was going to be about. We didn't know that he was an Indigenous student. When we found out that he was from the Katuk people, myself and the other non-Indigenous supervisor at the time got very excited about this. But he didn't want to know. He'd come here for the Western way of thinking. That's what he wanted to learn. One of the things that we did, because we realized this was a, sort of something that could be really important, we encouraged him to go to an Indigenous workshop in New Zealand with Maori academics. And he came back a changed man. It wasn't something we could have done as non-Indigenous supervisors. He had to go and meet with his people in a sense. And he came up with a completely different perspective. And I realized at that time that we needed to have an Indigenous supervisor, that there were limits to what we could do, no matter how well-intentioned we were, how much we wanted to read, how much we wanted to understand, there were limits. So fortunately, Professor Mark Rose joined it at the time. But he came quite late to Alan's thesis, but he was able to put something into that thesis, to bring something along to it, to help Alan make a few changes. But it wasn't a thesis from an Indigenous standpoint approach. Now, when Mark Jones joined us, of course, that was a totally different kettle of fish, because I'd learned a lot. Mark Rose was part of that research team. And so that was very much, as you can see, it was very much an Indigenous thesis, written from an Indigenous standpoint approach, with a theory and practice all the way through. I don't think Mark showed his original theoretical model that he had up. It was very quite traditional, but you saw where he ended up in his final chapter, and the thesis was very much about that transformation. So I've learned so much on the 10 years that I've been involved in this journey. One of the things that I've always found very important is, and I would say to non-Indigenous researchers, is you've got to be history informed. You've got to understand not only about colonisation in the past, but colonisation currently. It's absolutely key. And one of the things that you will find on your journey, and some of it you'll be really surprised by, is the kind of everyday racism and stereotypes and prejudice and bias that you see, covert and overt racism, polite racism. And you'll find that a lot of people are very defensive about the history, about the history of Australia's colonisation, and that comes out in assumptions that they make and biases that they have. I've seen my role all the way through this process as really trying to facilitate First Peoples' voice. So that means that sometimes means challenging things, you know. So when Mark was first of all talking to me about yarning, I would say, well, the way that you're explaining it just sounds like doing qualitative research to me. It just sounds like qualitative interviews. So what is different? And it was really, I think, when Mark went out and did his interviews with the community and came back and we talked about it, and you could see how different it was. So that theory and practice is absolutely so important. I think as a non-Indigenous supervisor, you bring a lot to the relationship. You probably know a lot about your discipline or your methodology, and perhaps you're very experienced in getting published. And so you do bring a lot. But that should give you confidence to encourage your student to validate what they have, and to validate their knowledge, and to encourage them to take risks and think differently and do things differently, as opposed to try to stop them from doing that, which is something that Dennis talked about, saying you can't do something. Actually, it's saying that you can. And often as non-Indigenous academics and people generally, we have a deficit approach to our Indigenous students, and we think we can fix them. And really, we need to fix ourselves. And I would say that the last point, to ask yourself, do you have the supervisory capacity for connection and relationality? Because you've got to be in for the long haul. You've got to commit. You've got to be prepared that it will change your way of thinking. But I think that's actually a good thing. So moving on to the next slide, because then I've got to very quickly pivot and move to getting your work published. Okay, because in academia, no matter who you are, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we survive by getting our work published. So I'm also co-editor of a journal some of you may be familiar with, Personal Review. It's an international HRM journal. We all know that publishing in academic journals is difficult. For example, Personal Review receives approximately 1,000 submissions a year. We have a less than 10% acceptance rate. You've got to situate your paper in the discipline of the journal, and you've got to have some kind of so what question. So when you start to think about, next slide please, publishing First Peoples research, how does that happen in this really competitive and difficult publishing environment? Well, I think step one is what everybody has been saying through all of this webinar. If you're going to do research, it's got to be by, with, and for. And what I've seen over the last 10 years, doing a lot of reading and doing a lot of literature reviews in this area, is just how much literature is actually not by, with, and for. There might have been some element of consultation somewhere with a particular Indigenous group, but often it's on Indigenous people. And you actually start to recognize it after a while. First of all, you know there's something kind of wrong with it, but you can't quite see what it is. But the more you read, the more understanding you have, then the more you see that. And Mark's given some examples of some things that have gone really, really, really badly wrong for those authors. But I think there's also an opportunity at the moment. So Kevin, who Mark has mentioned, is our PhD student, our Gringy man, who's hopefully will be submitting in the next few months. He's taken a kind of similar approach to Mark in a sense, you know. So he started off his thesis with a fairly traditional kind of theoretical framework. He's now finishing off with his two-eyed seeing. So what he's been doing is using both Western theory and an Indigenous lens approach, which the way that he's kind of developed that is in terms of theory and practice and his journey. And then he's findings at the moment from both perspectives. And I think as a co-editor, that there's actually a lot of possibility and potential at the moment for the marrying of an Indigenous knowledges approach with Western literature, because that can actually make a real theoretical contribution. And in that sense, then your methodological approach can also be a contribution. And I'm really behind at the moment. I read, I think it was a paper, it was last year, I might have been this year, paper in Human Relations, which is actually looking at the Maputo group, a tribe in Chile, and their fight against BHP. And it's the way that it's written, the methodology is very, very different. It's kind of an ortho-ethnicity, and also the way that they're drawn on Indigenous ways of thinking, and that's published in a top journal. So I think that's actually some kind of we should be feeling a little bit more comfortable and challenged by some of that, and there might be some opportunities. But my big challenge, finding the right journal. So my final slide is what is best practice in First People scholarship for journals? You know, is this the right journal? So there is a lot of, if you can see from this first quote, there's actually a lot of discussion at the moment in scholarly journals and scholarly publishing houses about realizing that a lot of scholarly publishing is not sufficiently diverse and representative, and starting to challenge that. So some questions that we have from some of the experiences that we've had over the past few years would be, when you look at some of these journals, are the editors-in-chief, the associate editors, the special editors, the people who make the decisions, the gatekeepers about what comes in, what gets sent out for review, are they aware of the importance of by, with, and for? Do they understand the value of two-eyed thinking, two-eyed seeing and two-eyed thinking? Do they have First Peoples reviewers? Do they have a developmental and relational approach to article development? And do they understand the importance of a two-way street? Because to my mind, this whole journey that I've been on has been a journey that I've learned so much. It's changed my way of thinking about things. But you really do have to commit. And I think it's now time for questions or discussion. Thank you.
Christian, are you running some questions, comments?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe just shift the camera there, Mandy, so we can see Dennis and Mark. So I might, we might chuck up that last slide up as well in a little bit as well, just so you can get that QR code. So for those of you online, you're able to put some questions in the chat or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Otherwise, those of you in the room, you can do it the old-fashioned way and chuck your hand up. Did anyone want to kick us off for any questions or comments as we get started? Perhaps I'll start and abuse my privilege as moderating. So I think Pauline was talking a little bit about towards the end there about different journal practice, and I know different journals are adopting different practices about how they review and sort of editorialise regarding First Peoples research. We've also seen sort of the emergence of First Peoples journals as a sort of an alternative as well. I wonder if anyone wanted to speak about perhaps the position of, or the importance of these, you know, journals such as like Lowitja that's come up, or you know, the Indigenous Business Journal that Charlie Roy Dyer is starting as well. The importance of creating those spaces as opposed to also making sure that existing academic journals are, you know, getting better for recognising, acknowledging, and publishing Indigenous research. Mark, you reckon?
Oh, look, I think I'd probably start off by saying there's not in these things called business schools or colleges, there's not a huge number of First Peoples scholars, so it is challenging. I mean, we have metrics like everyone in the room and likely online of where our institutions want us to publish. Indigenous journals are ranked certainly. I can't think of too many. Maybe one that's Dennis might jump in that might get me maybe a pat on the back from the institution. But I really like the idea of for some First Peoples journals that are being launched. You know, UQ is launching one, which is fantastic because it's about business, and we also see in North America IBAPA, which is Indigenous Business and Public Administration. So these journals, they're starting to appear now. So everything's continually evolving, but I really like to support both. And you know, like I said, I'm an academic on my L plate, so I'm still learning. But there's certainly publications that I'm looking to, that I'm really enjoying the interaction. So I think they're both important. And you know, I think getting into these A and A star journals, yes, it's difficult for all of us, as Pauline said, but I think there's change afoot from when Dennis started, and that's what you know. And so I really look at the people like you know, Dennis and Aileen Morton Robinson and Mark Rose. These people were real trailblazers, and they've made it easier for me. And, you know, so. You know, thanks, brother.
The Journal of Indigenous Australian Issues is the oldest Australian journal that I'm aware of, and it has an all Indigenous editorial board except for the main editor, which is Andrew Gunston, and it's the oldest one, and it just failed getting an A last time it was reviewed. So it's a B. Yeah, but it is so hard to get published in business journals. Yeah, when my job was on the line, I got published in an education A journal and a history A, and I kept my job. Yeah, I mean, the business. I had to go in a different discipline to get published. You know, it's heartbreaking. Yeah. And I've given up actually. The last 5 years, I've totally given up trying to get published in an A-grade journal, whether it be in Australia, New Zealand, or America. So yeah. Or Europe.
So can I just, I think there's more opportunity now than there has been. I absolutely agree. In the past, it's been very difficult, but I think the challenge now is this issue of by, with and for. I think that a lot of editorial teams are just not can't judge whether the quality of the research is such that should even be sent out for review. And that was the example that Mark put up, remember, with the retracted slide with all the things that were taken out. Now, that was a paper that was published in a journal, business journal, which we all complained about because it was on Indigenous people. It was not by, with, and for, and there was a whole lot of problems with it when you actually read it. But the way that, when you look at the way that journals are structured, I mean, that was part of a special issue. There'd be a special issue editor who were obviously not educated in this area, who sent it out for review. We don't know what the reviews had to say, but it ended up being published. So I think it's really important that editors of business journals educate themselves and their special issue editors, their associate editors, on what is acceptable and what is good academic research, in good Indigenous academic research, and what it really means to be by, with, and for. So having a bit of consultation at the side with your mates, getting to know some few people, that's not by, with, and for. And I think that's, to me, that's absolutely crucial.
Yes, Stanton.
I want to throw a dead cat on the table in terms of are there particular challenges for quantitative research in applying this methodology? Because we talked about, I mean, Pauline was very optimistic about two-eyed seeing, but there's a question whether or not how it can be adopted in a sense. If you're trying to count categories and measure things, metrics, if you will, across Indigenous and non-Indigenous experience. I learned a word today, onto epistemologies, and it makes sense within the Indigenous context. But if you're trying to apply it in a general sense and count these phenomena, can be tricky. And a case in point, which I enjoyed the history. I knew Dennis before his transformation, actually, so nothing to do with me, of course. But I did also have something to do with Karen Mark in the days of ELSIC, when they were trying to work out how to collect information on Indigenous children. This was in the very early days when she was actually publishing a thesis, and we had some interesting debates and things like that. But it was trying to measure, ELSIC tries to measure things within a culturally informed framework within the Indigenous community, but the actual, from a policy perspective, and almost all policy perspectives I know, they're interested in intercultural space. So what's happening with Indigenous children and non-Indigenous children, that's a really important question. And so, the actual collection of data in a numerical sense, and ELSIC attempted that, was very much focused on the Indigenous, what things were important for Indigenous people, as opposed to what was comparable across things. So is there a tension there? And can you apply Indigenous standpoint theory adequately and satisfyingly to the quantitative domain? There are particular sets of challenges. I mean, you can apply some of the principles by, with, and for, but the actual epistemological and ontological epistemology, combining being with understanding how you understand the world, there's a particular set of challenges where you're trying to apply it in an intercultural space. So that's my dead cat.
Oh, I'm a qualitative researcher.
Yeah, no,
Dodge the cat.
I think you can if you do a comparative study. If you've got a comparative study with similarities, I think you can.
Yeah. Well, ELSIC should have been that, but it wasn't. And it wasn't because it was driven towards a particular onto-epistemological approach, in a sense. And it was also driven there by lack of funding from federal governments, of course, but we won't go there.
So my answer is yes. It can be, but there's got to be comparative.
Well, it's doing it with is as important as everything else. Like when you're trying to compare things across, it's absolutely essential. Anyway, listen, I just think it's hard to publish things.
But by way of example, so I'm a qualitative researcher, but it was about data and numbers. I'd actually in practice demonstrate the width piece, and I would reach out to someone like Maggie Walter or Jacob Pren, who are involved in Indigenous data sovereignty, because I know that they're quantitative researchers, and I'd have that yarn with them to help guide me. That's what I do, because as a starting point. So if Dennis says it can be in that comparative piece, I know I can take a standpoint on that comparison. So I know that for sure. But I would seek out and involve people who I think have more expertise in that space than me.
Just in the interest of time, I've got one last question online, and we can carry on the discussion in the room for people who want to stick around, but I appreciate people to go. There is a question about really interesting discussion. The point about transactional interactions really resonated with me in particular. I wonder if the panelists have any perspectives on the increased requirements from ethics committees that researchers consult with First Peoples and ACO, so Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisations, when our research includes First Peoples, in brackets, as part of incidental recruitment. I've gotten pretty clear feedback from ACOs. Sorry, I've lost it. I've gotten pretty clear feedback from ACOs that they are tired of being consulted and are understandably burnt out. Do you have any advice about how we can do these consultation processes better, or how we can include the perspective for First Peoples in research process without being a burden on their time?
I agree with the person saying that there's just too much burden, and ethics committees by and large are ridiculous sometimes.
I've certainly seen the hatrix that I've been on, people doing the transactional piece, like the lack of specificity and who is the community organisation or the community for looking to, I guess, endorsement or, this is what we're thinking of doing. I think you've got to build relationality, and it's got to be reciprocity. And so, I certainly have done this. I'm doing this currently with a non-Indigenous academic at the Faculty of Business and Economics in accounting, of all things. Accounting is sexy apparently, but we've worked really hard, and he gave up. He gave up pushing me for time. It wasn't so much pushing me. I said, and he's now accepted, and he's built these relationships over this whole year, and so he's taken his time. So the equivalent of Kinaway, which is the Victorian, Chamber of Commerce, and BAI, the Victorian Aboriginal Education Institute. He's taken his time to build relationships and to build reciprocity, and offering some of the services, for example, in maths, and how we can support our people in maths. So, so that's a good example to overcome it. But I think the expectations are high on people applying through Hatrix. But I personally have no problem with the First Peoples research going through a HREC. What I have a problem with is if there's a lack of representation of First People on the HREC who can then help educate the whole panel. That to me is problematic, but reciprocity and building relationships is the only way I can suggest how to overcome that fatigue.
It's also, you've got to look at what's achievable. When I was at a university just north of Sydney, I won't say its name, but it starts with N, and they sell a lot of coal. They said I had to get an approval of ATSIC. All these, I had to get all these approvals for research on individual successful business women who were entrepreneurs. And I came back and I said, okay, I'll do it as long as you can guarantee me that all the business research students get approval of the RSLs, Apex and all that sort of stuff. They said, that's ridiculous. So, well, that's the comparative, and then they realised how stupid they were. But why would I have to go get approval of all these government departments and other organisations? I wanted to research individual successful female entrepreneurs. And they said, no, I had to get all these approvals of all these government departments. It's crazy. Yeah. So yes, I fully agree with the ethics committees quite often are totally out of control. And they have no idea about the reality of what they're asking, and what they're putting on us. Yeah.
There is a sort of a push on comment from that about that point, but I realise we're over time, so maybe we can have a discussion in person online. I do appreciate we didn't get to all the questions, so I do apologise for that. Thank you again all for attending online. Thank you for coming. Thanks so much, everyone.